Okay, so I'm starting a new commission today. I am building this media shelf for a client who has a pretty extensive gaming collection. One of their favorite games is Super Mario Brothers. So you may recognize this ring here from the desk that I built back in December. And for this build, I iterated on that design, but I played off the Smash Brothers trophy. So the 3 vertical bars represents that thick vertical line in the trophy, and the shelf is that thin horizontal band. So the segmented ring is what we're going to start building today. So let's head out in the shop and get started. All right, I'm going to start out by cutting my accent strips for the segmented ring, and I'm going to use holly for it. Now, holly is incredibly expensive. This little board here, not even 8 feet long, costs over $100. So I'm going to very carefully do some math here to make sure that I am not wasting any wood here. I'm only going to mill up what I need and cut those slices out. All right, so hopefully I did the math correct because I need 2-inch long strips and I need 100 of these guys. And hopefully I accounted for this knot. This knot's probably a $20 knot right there. So hopefully I got enough figured out here. I got my blade lowered down here just because small parts are dangerous and a stop set up. So let's cut these guys out. All right, let's see here. See if we got them all here. 5, 10, 15, 20, 25, 30, 35, 40, 45, 50, 55, 60, 65, 70, 75, 80, 85, 90, 95, 100. All right, so just out of curiosity, I did the math, and each one of these guys out of that $100 board is 10 cents. So that's materials, not the decade of labor I spent cutting all these little parts out. So since I got all the little accent pieces cut out, it's time to cut up the main wood for the segment, and that is going to be our walnut. So I'm going to mill this guy up. All right, so I am ripping these guys a little bit wide, and that is because oftentimes when you go to rip a wide board into narrower strips, it releases tension in the wood, and the wood starts to pinch the blade or twist away from the blade or something. And so then you don't end up with a perfectly straight board. So I ripped it about a 1/4 inch wide, and then I'm going to joint an edge at the joiner to make sure I'm re-squared back up, and then I will rip it to its final width. And that's because I really want to make sure that all my segmented rings are cut with the perfect angle. So if this board is twisted at all, it's going to throw off the angle. My ring isn't going to close up perfectly. All right, so I got my wedgie jig set up, ready to cut my segments on my finished piece. Before I cut those, I did take a few minutes to do a couple of test cuts to make sure that I have this thing dialed in. If this measurement is just a little bit off, it could throw off the whole thing because it's compounded 24 times. So whatever air you have in one, multiply that by 24 times. So dialed it in, and let's get going. All right, so the main segmented ring is going to be made up of 4 smaller rings. So now that I have them all cut, I'm making sure that I'm keeping them in order so that way the color is all the same going around the ring. If one board is a little bit lighter than the other board and I mixed them up, I might have this weird white or light color one in a dark round circle. So I'm making sure I'm keeping them all together. So now let's glue them up. All right, so since this is going to be a really big ring and very difficult to clamp, I'm just going to use blue tape to clamp it. So I'm going to roll out a roll of tape here, a line of tape on the edge of my workbench, sticky side up, and I'm going to tape it down here to the edge of my workbench. Helps to have 2 rolls. All right, and I'm just going to pull this guy down. All right, so now that I get down here at the other end, I'm going to give it a little tug, just pull it tight very gently. I don't want to pull too tight and rip the tape off the other end. Get to say some cuss words and start over again if I do that. All right, and then I'm going to put a straight edge down. I'm going to line this straight edge up along the edge of my tape. Clamp it down real good. All right, and then I'm just going to stick my pieces down to the tape. All right, I'm going to use a epoxy to glue this all together since there's so many parts. That way I have plenty of time to get it all together before the glue sets up, unlike a PVA, which sets up really quick and will probably get me in trouble before I get it all done. And since a lot of this is end grain, I am going to go over it twice to give it a chance to soak into that end grain. All right, so I'm going to stick my segmented ring down to this piece of plywood that's nice and flat and send it to the drum sander so I can smooth out and flatten out this. And then I'll be able to glue each one on top of each other here. So I'm just going to do this with blue tape. Peter, I'm almost out of blue tape. All right, my sander isn't big enough to sand all of this circle in one swipe. So I've marked my starting point here of which flat side of my plywood jig is facing to me. So that way I can turn it around and sand again and just keep turning it as I sand. So that way I know that I've sanded all the way around and I should be relatively flat. All right, so I have my ring sanded top and bottom, so I'm getting ready to do the glue up, and I have a little bit of layout to do. I want to find center of this guy so that way I can line it up here because I want to stagger these guys for decorative appearances, and then also staggering that joint will make the ring much stronger. So then once I find center here, I'm going to do that on 3 different points because just because this one's center doesn't mean that the other side's not spinning around this center point here. So if I find it in 3 different points, it should line up really well. All right, since these rings are still kind of fragile in this state before we get everything glued up, I'm going to use this backer board here just to help add some additional strength and backing while I get everything clamped together. That way it doesn't break on one of these seams here. Probably should have raised these up a little more. get it lined up here. All right, I guess I probably shouldn't have raised those up. A little more stable. All right, next ring. All right, and since this glue is still really wet, it could slide around while I tighten the clamps down. So I'm going to just really gently drop the clamps down and just work my way around fairly slowly, adding a little pressure at a time. As I tighten it down, I'm going to make sure I keep an eye on my lines just so they don't slide and get out of whack. If it's no longer in center, it's going to ruin the look. All right, so I have every inch of this thing clamped up, so I should end up with a nice solid piece when I'm done. So I'm just going to let this sit overnight to cure. All right, looks pretty good. Let's set up to cut it round now. All right, so I'm going to reuse this board that I cut for the sanding purposes to make a circle jig to route against. So I have some layout lines here and my trammel set up in the center point. All right, there's our outer radius. All right, I have my circle jig set up here, and I'm going to cut the outer circle first, because if I cut the inner circle first, the outer circle would be free and flopping all over the place, so it wouldn't work out very well for me. All right, so the idea is I'm going to put this guy on here and then use a pattern routing bit to route out the circle on both sides. All right, hindsight is 20/20, and I probably should have made my original ring a little bit thinner. So to save some tear out and work on the router, I am going to use the bandsaw to cut this down a little bit. All right, I'm going to use this compression bit to follow along my pattern here to route out my circle. I'm going to take the top bearing off so that way it clears this material. I'm going to route from one side, and then I'm going to switch the bearing to the top or a different router bit that has a top bearing, and I'll flip it over and route from the other side. And that way I should have a nice clean face here. All right, so I cut almost halfway, so then I'm going to switch over to this bit. That'll span that last little bit and use this bearing to ride this, and we'll just flip this guy over. All right, with my standard router base on this thin material here, it was a little rocky feeling, so I didn't feel super secure with that. So I changed out my router base to something a little more substantial to give me a more solid base to route with. So hopefully this will be less likely to wobble. All right, our ring is done. The last thing to do is some off-camera sanding, and then next video we will start building the shelves that this guy goes into. Thanks for watching.